Welcome to everybody, and welcome, Dennis. It's been a couple of years, I think, since you came and talked to Horizon House. We very much appreciate you being here. Try and see if I can turn on my picture. I am not, oops. We are a whole bunch of people who are not very adept at the new, new technology.
I really miss my granddaughter.
Right. Anyhow, we have a number of people who want to ask you questions, and you had said that you hope to spend most of the program with questions, but because this is not a regular Zoom program, the system we had to change to a webinar in order to be able to simultaneously broadcast this on Horizon House Television and also on YouTube. Therefore, most of these people in your audience you will not see, but you will see their names. I hope maybe pretty soon and you'll be able to see me, but I just did that wrong somehow. There we go. Thank you. Dennis, you are somebody who almost needs no introduction, though we have been sending out little notices to people for a considerable while. I first met you in the 1970s and have admired you ever since. Read some, but not all of the things you have written. And we appreciate the fact that about 15 or more years ago, you moved back to Seattle, moved back to Washington State, your home state, and have been here in Seattle and with the Bullitt Foundation doing good work since then. I'm just going to let you go ahead and talk about whatever you want to talk about for a little while, and then we will ask other people to join in. But first, let me see whether Bill Roach or Risa will give some more explanation to the audience. And Bill or Risa will have to mute themselves to explain the system by which questions happen.
Okay, so after Dennis is done speaking and we offer the Q&A portion, people can raise their hands, they can use the chat function, or Bill will look for that and then he'll acknowledge that, or Dennis can acknowledge if he sees it, and we will go that way.
Okay.
All righty.
If we don't remember, then we will ask for instructions again. Go ahead, Dennis.
That sounds good. Well, Jean, it's great to see you again. And although we're not in physical proximity, it's great to be virtually back at Horizon House. The other part of the connections that Jean didn't mention was that she was a grantee of the Bullitt Foundation when she was running the Wilderness Society office here. I worked for a place called the World Watch Institute in Washington, D.C., and some years after I left, her son went there and held the same job that I had had. And then he moved to Seattle, where he too became a grantee of the Bullitt Foundation, running the Sightline Institute. So a lot of connections back there. I have mostly in recent months been talking to people who are 14 to 25. And part of this youth climate movement that has sprung up around the world and has very strong participation here in the United States. For most of those youngsters, the Beatles are viewed as kind of contemporaries of the founding fathers. It's really a little bit unnerving to talk about history and have them gaze at me much like I might have, spoken of Abraham Lincoln. With you, I think I can talk a little bit about a few decades past that helps set the stage for what we will be hopefully discussing afterwards. In 1978, the National Academy of Sciences, which is arguably the most prestigious scientific organization on the planet, did a comprehensive study based upon elaborate computer modeling and such data as they had, that showed that the threats from climate change were greater than had been understood previously, at least had been understood by objective science previously. And they were cautious. They said this is based upon a series of assumptions, a set of data points that will become more robust in future years, and elaborate modeling. But it looks like we are in real trouble. And if we wait until we actually experience the impacts of climate change, the die will have already been cast. So that was 1978. It was about the same time that we had a war going on in the Middle East between Iraq and Iran. A few years earlier, there'd been the Arab oil embargo, which had caused the price of oil to increase 400%. In the Iraq war, the price of oil went up another 100%. It doubled. And then we had this National Academy of Sciences report saying if we continue to consume all of that oil, as well as the most abundant domestic resource that was an alternative, coal, we and the planet will be in terrible shape. All of which led the Carter administration, and in fact Jimmy Carter himself, to declare a really bold goal to get 20% of all the nation's energy, not just its electricity, but all of its energy from renewable energy resources by the year 2000. I was at that time running something called the Solar Energy Research Institute, which is now the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and was given a couple $1 million, the ability to hire people from other national laboratories and prestigious universities, and charged with both developing the technology, which was the main thing that the Solar Energy Research Institute did, but then this couple $1 million study to sort of lay out how you might approach such a goal. Could you really, in fact, achieve 20% in what was literally 22 years? Turned out that the way that you could do that was by affecting the denominator, by investing very, very, very heavily in the most efficient everything, the most efficient buildings, the most efficient cars, the most efficient airplanes, the most efficient industrial processes, refrigerators, and on and on. Changes in lighting to give you just as much illumination, but use a trivial fraction, maybe 10% as much electricity to produce it. And then having squeezed down the demand with no sacrifice in lifestyle or productivity or wealth, meeting 20% of the remains was, we thought, doable with some fairly bold public policies. Building a little bit upon the sort of experience that we've had with the federal government driving down the cost of computer chips or driving down the cost of pharmaceuticals by buying huge amounts of them and letting the companies ride the learning curve, and each marginal new unit would become cheaper. And we had a methodology that said that that same basic phenomenon that you use with computer chips could be used with another semiconductor technology, photovoltaic arrays to produce solar power, and with different curves and different cost estimates for wind power as well. 2 years later, Ronald Reagan was elected president. He did not share this vision of the nation's future. He famously ripped Carter's solar panels off the roof of the White House, which is about as emphatic a symbolism as you could have. Somewhat less symbolic and more substantive. The institute that I was heading had its budget cut by 80%. That was more than $100 million lopped off our budget. He fired about a third of my staff, including a bunch of tenured professors who'd given up their tenure to come out and work for this Manhattan project for a solar future. Fired all of our contractors that afternoon, including 2 who went on to win Nobel Prizes, and basically just laid waste to this entire effort for no reason that anyone was ever able to explain to me. So coming out of that, we've not had that kind of opportunity since. I've been fairly scathing in my condemnation of the climate policies and the energy policies of the Trump presidency. But in fairness, the Obama presidency was not doing what it needed to do. Barack Obama's energy policy, as he summarized it, was all of the above. Let's do some solar, let's do some wind, let's do some nuclear, let's do some clean coal, let's do some oil, let's frack some natural gas, let's do it all. George Bush was very much a creature of the oil industry, and Dick Cheney was, he was the Darth Vader, if you will, of energy policy in the United States. We'd had real hope for Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and on the bus as they were campaigning, Clinton was going to be handling domestic social policy, and Gore was going to be doing science and climate and renewable energy and perhaps parts of foreign affairs. They won the election, and afterwards there was one president and one vice president, and Gore just did not have that kind of a portfolio. So not much came out of the Clinton administration as well. And prior to that, Bush won, and before that we had Reagan. So it's been, and being really honest, Carter was a mixed bag. I mean, he gave me the best job I've ever had in my life and the opportunity to really make a difference, and I cherish him for that. But he also developed the Synfuels Corporation, which was going after tar sands and going after oil shale and going after coal gasification. He had an energy mobilization board, which, at least for the duration of the Iraq-Iran war, would have abolished all environmental constraints on new energy production in the United States. So if you are me, much of your adult career has been getting us off of fossil fuels and onto the super efficient use of renewables. It has been an exercise at its best, an exercise in frustration. Now we have a contest between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And in the first debate between the two, I'm using the term debate very, very loosely, the moderator caught Biden completely off guard. He'd announced what the issues were going to be that they were to discuss, but then at the end of the debate pulled climate change out with no warning. And I'm afraid Biden was like a deer caught in the headlights. He was the weakest climate person that was running for the presidency from any party, including the Green Party. He was it just was not his issue. I mean, Biden has some things that he's very skilled at and cares a lot about. Energy and climate just isn't on that short list. So afterwards, having come out in favor of fracking because he really needs to carry the state of Pennsylvania, and he's convinced there are more votes to be won than lost there. And I think because he probably believes it's a good idea. In a variety of other ways, has distanced himself from the most exciting of the proposals that are on the table, albeit an incredibly vague proposal for a Green New Deal. He found himself like a deer in the headlights when these questions came at him. And then the president, with that remarkable ability that he has to pull things out of thin air, said that Biden had endorsed the Green New Deal and that it would cost $100 trillion to, well, one, there isn't enough detail in the Green New Deal to give you any reasonable price tag, but the responsible organizations, university professors and think tanks that have looked at it have posited it as being, over the course of the next administration, the next 4 years, if it were embraced, which Biden clearly isn't going to do, the price tag would have been somewhere in the range of about $5 trillion, which is about 40% more than we spent earlier this year on a 4-month CARES package just to try to maintain the economic status quo from this pandemic that got unleashed on the American public, and which has not only destroyed much of the, undermined much of the economy, but has caused the lives of 4 times as many Americans as died in Vietnam and 40 times as many Americans as died in the World Trade Center. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying with all of that is it would be expensive, but it's in the range of things that we have done when we faced serious problems at all. In any case, Biden did not handle himself very well, and wrapping this introductory set of comments up, I think where that leaves people like me, and candidly like Jane's son, who's also working heavily in this area, is with a presidency that we think may be responsive if we can build a really strong social movement that demands that we bring about the bold kinds of changes that are needed, and that simply will not move on its own initiative unless we have that kind of citizen power. Going back to that 1978 study that said if we wait until the effects of climate change are clearly visible, the die will have already been cast. We've burned 4 million acres in California this year, by far the largest forest fires in the history of the state. The second largest were 2 million acres. That was the year before last. In Australia, the bushfires killed 3 billion animals. I mean, can you think of a more horrible way to die than have 3 billion burned to death? We've had as many as 5 hurricanes circulating simultaneously in the Atlantic. This year, we've run out of alphabetical letters to name storms after, so now Hurricane 2020 Delta is going to be striking the Gulf Coast tomorrow morning. We've got the disappearance of the glaciers that feed the major irrigation rivers of the world. We've got rising seas that are wiping out the rice-producing river deltas of East Asia. It's just thing after thing after thing. We are now feeling the impacts of climate change, and if we could somehow stop producing greenhouse gases tomorrow afternoon, there is so much accumulated in the atmosphere, and it will last for sufficiently long that for some decades into the future, it will continue to warm. So we don't have time to fool around. It really is a moment when it would be great to have wonderful national leadership here. National leadership, candidly, any place on the planet. But those of us in the environmental community and those 14 to 25-year-old youths who really had this in their craw and had a head of steam behind them before COVID-19 killed that movement, or again, undermined that movement. I think they're committed to the future, and I think we will pull it off. And if Biden gets elected president, I think we can work with him and work with the Congress to get some important strides done. And I guess I have no hope at all if Donald Trump gets reelected, because he has been as forthright as he could be that this Chinese hoax is not something that we should be wasting our time on. Okay, that's the introductory statement, hopefully sufficiently provocative to have stirred up a few questions and maybe even some rebuttals, and let's get started.
We will have Bill Roach, and if as needed, other people identify you. If you are listening, you did your due duty of signing up on the right system, but somehow didn't get your picture on. We still want to hear from you. So you can use the Q&A point on your phone, or you can use the raise your hand. First question.
First
Tom?
question is from Tom Spiro, I think. So Tom?
Mute yourself.
Unmute.
Let us see your picture.
Unmute yourself. Tom?
Unmute.
Tom, unmute yourself.
There we go.
There
Okay.
you go.
Okay.
Okay. Dennis, thank you very much. And especially thank you for sticking with it over the 50 some years that you watched this unfold. At Horizon House, we have an environmental committee, as you know. Jean is the chair and Bonnie is the co-chair, which has done a good job of monitoring the Horizon House environmental footprint, recycling, energy use, and so on. And has also reached out to other residents with films and talks. But now the question is, how can we get involved in this social movement that you called, as you called it, most effectively? All of us who are aware, get emails from any number of environmental organizations saying, please send money, write your congressman, sign a petition. It's a bit overwhelming. Our thought is that if we could organize ourselves as a group to do a focused thing, we'd be much better off. And so with your experience with environmental organizations, what do you think would be the best strategy going forward? Is there an organization that can help us achieve some of their goals? We have active people in Horizon House who, for example, have written now 5,000 get out the vote letters in a group that we've organized. That sort of model should be applicable to environmental causes. We just have to pick the right one and the right organization, it seems to me. I wonder what your reaction is.
Um, Well, it will depend a lot upon the political profile of the members of the committee. The most activist organizations, and what I would, for all kinds of reasons, highly recommend are some of the younger groups, the 350.org, the Sunrise Movement. I was in a conference with a 14-year-old girl from the Sunrise Movement who was more mature, more articulate than probably 80 members of the United States Senate are. I mean, she just blew me away, and deeply committed on this issue. She's African American, but had lived a few years in South Africa, has some third world experience, and just brought reason and a dispassionate analysis to it that was quite remarkable. And there are just all sorts of people like that that are involved in it, with those organizations. And I have this dream of sort of local groups across the country creating what I think of as gray-green alliances. We gray elders meeting with some of these green younger folks who, are a little bit dismissive, as we were in our youth, of the mistakes of people who have failed to address this issue over the last half century. But at the same time, they're enormously flattered if you will ask them to come in and ask them how you can help them meet their needs. So I'd reach out to them and see if one of them will come in and maybe talk with you and figure out what you can do together. That's as soon as the COVID thing is behind us. I mean, there's just all sorts of things that make sense in a world where we've got interactions that we just can't do right now. For more established organizations, the Sierra Club is terrific. There's a group called Climate Solutions that is regional, and it's again more mainstream, but very, very solid. And the Washington Environmental Council has a very strong climate program. But I would really love to see something where the elder people and the younger people get together and flank those folks that are sort of right smack mainstream. And of course, the most important thing that any of us can do right now is vote.
Right. Well, all of this is for after the election. But some of the political organizations, Swing Left, for example, have become very sophisticated about organizing people online, even in the absence of face-to-face contact. And I'm wondering if some of the groups you mentioned are getting, I mean, they're all tech savvy, whether they have thought about that as well.
Oh, they are, for the most part, virtual organizations, particularly the teenage ones. They built this international movement where if you're 20 years old, you're an elder, entirely on the backs of Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, and increasingly TikTok is becoming a platform for them. So yeah, they do that. The reason that I was suggesting that it would be good to have face-to-face, it's to build a relationship where you get to trust them and they get to trust you, and that's just more difficult to do for people that don't know one another and are doing what we're doing right now.
350.org and the Sunrise Movement are the two youthful ones that you.
Yeah, there are some others as well, but those are the most powerful and engaged and involved right now that actually do activist kind of work and sort of political work.
Good. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Other questions? Henry, I see you have a raised hand. Do you want to, Risa, how do we get Henry Kuharik to identified?
We will not get Henry's picture to see, but if Henry can unmute himself, then I think he can ask his question.
Right. Henry, did you hear that? If you unmute yourself, you could ask your question.
It'll be Henry Kuharich.
Kuharich, yes. Sorry, I got that wrong. No?
Hang on, we have to allow
Here
him
we
to
are.
talk.
Henry, you're still muted.
Unmute yourself, Henry.
There we go. I got you now. You can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. My question is, about sequestering carbon dioxide, which of course contributes considerably to global warming. And the fact that photosynthesis has been very important in sequestering carbon dioxide into the soil, and then the plants in exchange get nutrients from the microbes that are in the soil that manufactured, and they are the ones that sequester the carbon dioxide. And it's interesting, I read somewhere about a weed that grows very well in dry areas that have poor soil, and these weeds are able to sequester carbon dioxide and leave it down in the soil. And there is a someone in Nori in Seattle, I don't know if you've heard of them, who are promoting paying farmers to help with photosynthesis,
Mhm.
which has been sort of overlooked as one of the important country areas to get rid of the carbon dioxide from our air.
Yeah, the only thing I take any exception to there, Henry, is that it's been overlooked. The efforts to try to get forestry programs basically throughout the world, longer rotation forestry here in the United States and more forested areas, trying to do it with FSC certified forestry, which leads to about 3 times as much carbon sequestration in the soil as conventional forestry does. To have agricultural practices that are also not mining the carbon out of the soil, as is typically done in cornfields and some of our other row crops, but to actually embrace some of the more innovative agricultural technologies, which are still pretty productive with regard to crops, but leave you every year with more carbon in the soil than you had before. When I'm talking about leaving carbon in the soil, I'm really talking about building up that rich black soil that you like, that's got a lot of tilth in it, holds onto water. You take the agricultural nutrients that are not food, it's the stalks, and leave them on the field in a chewed up fashion. Those microbes you were talking about digest them and they become topsoil. So there are lots of things that we can do, should do, and worldwide it turns out that we are sequestering less carbon every year from photosynthesis, which has this wonderful advantage that it's entirely powered by the sun, than we did the year before. And we have to start heading the other direction. That's really dominated by a few large global phenomena like the deforestation of the Amazon and of Indonesia and the parts of the Siberian forests. But you're absolutely right. Of the things that are there cheap, that we know how to do today, we should at least be doing that to the extent that the natural carbon cycle is intact. We will never be able to have enough of that is pulling out carbon at the rate that we are pouring it into the atmosphere now with our use of fossil fuels. But it's an important contributor, and it will more than take care of the carbon dioxide that we are breathing out and that our animals are breathing out. You know, the carbon cycle is this marvelous thing we don't probably pay enough attention to. All of nature are these various cycles: the hydrological cycle, the nitrogen cycle. The carbon cycle is, as I suspect all of you know, but I'll do it anyway just to fill a little bit of airtime. Plants using photosynthesis capture photons of energy from the sun, and through photosynthesis store them in hydrogen, carbon, phosphorus bonds in plants. And that energy is the currency of life on the planet. Everything that is done that doesn't involve human beings and our fossil fuels and other forms of cheap energy, everything else is powered by that captured sunlight through photosynthesis. And then, for example, to oversimplify a bit, animals come in, eat those plants, digest them through a process called oxidative phosphorylation, which then releases that energy where it can do work. And the carbon that is there, that is constantly circulated, is typically in balance, and you have as much coming out of the atmosphere as you have going into the atmosphere. And so at that point, you figure out what your atmospheric concentrations will be, and it allows you to have a fairly stable climate. Our problem is that beyond life, beyond photosynthesis and oxidative phosphorylation, if you will, metabolism, we have taken a lot of carbon that was sequestered over millions and millions of years and that got transferred into oil and into coal, and have been burning at a very fast rate. I mean, millions of years worth of stuff is being oxidized in the course of a century. And that has just thrown the system completely out of whack. And so at least the part of it that is powered by photosynthesis and metabolism, we've got to be bringing into balance. And you're right, a good way to do that is by planting the right kinds of crops and nurturing them. And some of those will be weeds that are going to be in remote areas and bad soil. Sometimes somebody sees one of those options and it looks really good, and you can do, thousands of acres of it, and you should do it. But it's not a magic bullet. I mean, you do all of that stuff because it's important to do, but it may be 1/100th of 1% of the needed carbon sequestration. I mean, we need to stop pouring carbon into the atmosphere and let these slow biological processes work. And the great hope of those who are looking for technological fixes is that we can find mechanisms that pull carbon dioxide out of, well, what they really want to do is to pull it out of smokestacks when they're burning coal or oil, so that instead of going into the atmosphere, they capture it and either stick it in the ground in some kind of deep caverns, or in their ideal forms, put it into some kind of a chemical compound like cement, where it will be bound up for a very long time into the future. And of course, the best of those is implicit in your question, Henry, is probably wood, where when it comes out and it's bound in wood, it will stay there for maybe a century or more.
Yes, these weeds apparently do that successfully. Now, I have one more comment. We know how important the Brazilian jungle is, and I have been for many years supporting organizations that presumably are saving the Brazilian jungle, and yet we're seeing it disappear again and again. I don't understand why nothing can be done to rescue those very essential trees that we need.
And it's a matter of sovereignty. It's Brazil's rainforest, and we can hope everything that we want to over here, but in the end, it's under their control. And Brazil has elected the functional equivalent of Donald Trump, a guy named Bolsonaro, who doesn't believe in climate change, is sort of a tool of the agricultural interests that want to cut down the rainforest. And to be perfectly honest as well, the biggest things that they're cutting down the rainforest for is to plant crops that will feed animals that we buy as meat in the developed world, and particularly in the United States. So it's possible that you ate a little bit of the Brazilian rainforest tonight over dinner inadvertently. But one of the ways you get past that, of course, is you just stop having confined animal feedlot operations, because that's where that grain is going.
But since the world depends on it, why can't?
Henry, let's let Connie have a turn to the next person.
Thank you.
I know you're not eating any meat. Go ahead, Bill. Bill? Can you get Connie on?
Any other questions?
Connie.
Am I on? And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. First, Dennis, I just want to say hi, because I knew you in passing when you were a student at Stanford Law School.
Uh-huh.
And I was on the staff there writing the alumni magazine, and I enjoyed doing a small profile on you. At any rate, what I'm wondering about is something that used to be talked about, but now seems to me kind of avoided as being perhaps un-PC, and that is population control. It almost seems to me like the elephant in the room. Is that old thought, or does that fit into your menu of possible solutions?
Well, it is the elephant in the room. It is an incredibly hot political button for all kinds of reasons. If you think the Brazilians don't want us to tell them what to do with their rainforest, the women of Brazil certainly don't want me telling them what they should do with their wombs. There's this very strong effort around the world to guarantee choice, and that's the choice to have a child, to have no children, or to have 15 children. And those choices are often going in directions that are unfortunate. The political left in this country historically has said you just have to realize, because developing countries don't have a population problem. We do, because it's population times consumption, and we consume so much more than they do that it just doesn't make any difference whether they have a lot of kids. To which the obvious answer is, well, that's true if they're going to remain poor forever, but even Chinese peasants don't want to be Chinese peasants. And those ratios that we were talking about 30 years ago for how much more we consume are shifting fairly dramatically. There are multiple issues. There are faiths that do not want to countenance birth control. The Catholic Church does not want to have birth control. Islam does not want to have birth control. I attended the United Nations Population Conference in Cairo, and armed guards were, 3 layers of them to get into the hotel, military vehicles in front of the bus and behind the bus as you're going to the conference center, all kinds of terrorist threats that we would come and try to design a program that would to deal with population. And the way that we wanted to deal with it was to give the women of the world opportunities to do things that gave them status and security besides having children. So it's access to birth control and birth control information, of course, but it's also education. It's also employment opportunities. It's also access to communications. For what it's worth, it was a pretty effective conference. It was something where the Clinton administration did something good. A guy named Tim Wirth was the head of the delegation, and he was masterful in pulling people together. The Vatican never came along, Malta never came along, Chile never came along, the Middle East, most of the countries didn't come along, but we had like 80%, 90% probably approval of a strong set of policies that required a commitment that the Clinton administration made at the conference for the United States. And we came back, and that fall, the Republicans took control of the Senate. Jesse Helms took control of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and everything that was proposed was killed. So once again, we kind of fell along the way there as well. Finally, when you're talking about something like democracy, and it's finally only because you don't want me to talk about this forever, I mean, this is a big, complex issue. But when you're talking about democracy, where you find yourself certainly here and in many other countries having identity politics. In Ireland, it was, are you Catholic or are you a Protestant? In many countries, it's that religious sort of thing. And in other countries, it's racial and ethnic groups. So if you are a minority, and you don't want to be a minority forever, because as long as you're a minority, you are politically disadvantaged, then it becomes very difficult for any other group to talk to you about trying to hold population in check. And so you find political leaders claiming racism when anyone even raises the subject, which causes nobody to raise the subject because nobody wants to be termed a racist. And it boils on time after time, way after way, and it really has proven to be the third rail that nobody much wants to touch. We will eventually, because the world has only so much carrying capacity, and we are way beyond it now. If you look at any conceivable technology that we can currently envision and the kind of affluence that the world has in, say, Germany or Japan today, not the United States, but other reasonably comfortable industrialized country, if that goes to the planet and everybody were to have that standard of living, then we now have probably at least 3 times as many people as the world can support, the environmental footprint of those people. And so unless you're going to be consigning large fractions of mankind to poverty forever, or you find yourself where they don't want to be impoverished forever, so they are going, and they don't want to be beset by climate catastrophes, so they migrate. And we're going to be seeing, driven by huge population pressures accompanied by climate change, these vast waves of immigration are causing great political difficulties in many parts of the planet.
I suppose I'm naive, but I've assumed that most women, if given a choice, would rather not have 6 children. And I saw it as a matter of giving women a choice as to the size, and that would take care of it. But you're right about the cultural and ethnic competition. That's very dispiriting.
Well, we think that you are right when you look at this in broad sociological terms, Connie. Most women over time, if given a genuine choice, I think will opt, and throughout the world have opted for smaller families. The things that militate against that are those places where there is no social security and there's relatively high childhood death rates. And so you have 6 kids in the hopes that 2 of them will survive to take care of you in your old age. But having said that, if to the extent you can provide some social safety net, you provide some education, you provide the right kinds of opportunities, I share your belief that most are going to be choosing to have. I mean, we're compared to somebody in a third world country. When my wife and I were deciding to have a family, we were ridiculously affluent compared to somebody, in the equatorial Africa. But we decided that if we had a child, we didn't want that child to leave college deeply in debt and being forced to go into some job that they didn't want to do and lead the first major segment of their adult life, sort of paying off their college debts. So we would only have a child that we could afford to send to get as much education as he or she wanted. And when we did a careful inventory of our assets, and we were both working for public interest organizations at very modest salaries, we decided we could afford 1 child. And that kind of rational choice, I think, is something that you see in a great many places. So as a consequence, that really trumps religion, and it really trumps ideology. Italy has a very low birth rate, despite the fact that it's all Catholic. Hong Kong has a very low birth rate. And places like Japan have really come to the point where they've got declining populations. So I think it will happen.
Andrew Gordon has a question for you. Andrew, you want to unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So let's imagine for a minute that Joe Biden wins. I hope it isn't a fantasy, but it certainly is important to think about. It's sad to see him paint himself into a corner about the Green New Deal, increasingly backing away from it, and then even getting Kamala to back further into a corner in her debate with Pence. It's almost becoming a no new taxes mantra. Can you imagine language we might provide for him that would allow him to be open to the most important elements of the Green New Deal going forward? I think if, for example, we were to go along with the Europeans, maybe Bolsonaro can be bought off. Just give him a lot of money, not to burn down the Amazon forest. And I think if we were to enter into the international arena in this way again, it might make a huge difference.
To take the easier of those questions, easier in comparison with the other, I do think that I don't think that Biden is going to be taken to us for language. He's got a huge number of wordsmiths and people who are helping him triangulate these issues. And for what it's worth, the Biden energy plan is actually quite good. I mean, I'm very critical of it because it has some things in it that in an ideal world we wouldn't have, but it may be politically what you need to do, because if he doesn't take Pennsylvania, he's in real trouble, and he thinks that this is what's necessary to do. But it's a calculation that, he's got a shot at being president and I don't, so he knows some things that I don't know. And when you get past that, we gave dollar figures to a bunch of those other things. The people who did the cost assessments in Congress of the Biden energy plan put it at about $2.5 trillion of good stuff. So this is not a nothing burger plan by any stretch. And whether he will hang with it after he's elected, or just like so many things in Democratic platforms, it'll be forgotten once people are in office. Time will tell. But that's again up to us on putting pressure on him and on members of Congress to do what they have run on for election. I will say that Kamala Harris last year got really quite active on this issue. I mean, she was not, in terms of presidential platforms on climate, Jay Inslee had by far the best. I think Jay's platform was the best platform ever put together by any political aspirant to leadership of any industrial country in the world. I mean, it was really exceptional. And of course, he didn't write it into office. But then Elizabeth Warren picked it up almost in sum total and just embraced it as hers. And she was able to hold on for a while longer. Bernie's was really pretty strong, though much more vague in its details than this was. But we had a whole bunch of people that we were encouraging, and then we had the movement out there encouraging them further and further. Meanwhile, you had the Democratic National Committee doing everything they could to keep climate off the agenda. They not only refused to let it come up as a topic initially for any of the primary debates, but they actually said that if the League of Conservation Voters hosted its own debate for people who were running in the Democratic primaries, and if any of the aspirants, any of the candidates went to the League of Conservation Voters, they would be banned from the Democratic National Committee's debates. I mean, it was a very, very aggressive stance. And it's because they were worried about certain parts of organized labor that are mining coal and that are fracking oil. And they just didn't want to run the risk of alienating those groups within the party. And that has really hamstrung folks. And that's, you know, a big part of the motive behind the Biden constituencies. He ran as the centrist. So I don't think it's a matter of simply wordsmithing. There are big pieces of machinery that are clicking one way or the other here. And what we have to do is make sure that as soon as we can organize ourselves again, that we start having those same kinds of rallies that we were putting together as recently as December, before COVID-19 started making it impossible. With regard to what one can do with Bolsonaro, I probably shouldn't even comment on it. I'm dubious. This is a guy, it's to try to influence him is pretty much like trying to influence Donald Trump. You just have no idea what's going to happen, but he should be a joke, but he is elected and is, with some parts of Brazilian population, enormously, fanatically popular.
Okay, Bob Brown has got a question. Bob? Unmute yourself to ask the question, please.
Some parts of the Brazilian population, enormously, fanatically popular.
You need to speak up, Bob.
Bob Brown's got a question. Bob? Unmute yourself to ask the question, please.
And also
Well-
turn off your television.
Well, I don't have a question.
Maybe it's here.
Oh, you don't have a question. All right. You have a
And my
raise.
question's been handled.
It's been handled. Okay.
Speak up, Bob.
Sorry about
Now, my
that.
question, I can't forget my question for now.
Okay. Unmute yourself again, please. There you go. Other questions, please.
I should
In the
hasten
mean-
to add that I can see right now on the screen in front of me, Gordon Orions. So I feel a little bit awkward sitting up here as the person that's answering questions when one of my all-time great heroes in the environmental field is sitting out there quietly muted. But you guys have an enormous resource at your disposal since this is over permanently right in the house.
Gordon, do you have something to say? No. All Other
Okay,
questions?
Dennis, in the meantime, could you spend a little more time talking about pressure? What it is, you said the enormous numbers of rallies that you hope we can have when we get over the COVID. How do you see rallies as being helpful in the political sphere, and what other versions of that the young organizations might take on? How do you see the effectiveness of that kind of public demonstration?
I'm a big believer in the powers of assembled numbers. I mean, we put together, when Earth Day for the 50th anniversary became impossible, we put together a virtual event. We had the Pope speaking at it. We had rock stars. We had movie stars. We had politicians. We had people that are doing clever things with street art that was then photographed and spread to the planet. It basically had no impact. If you put 750,000 to 1 million people on the mall in Washington, D.C. in front of the Capitol building, there's just something about that massing that happens. And so we all withdrew from that when COVID-19 hit. But then in March, and then again in May, a series of assassinations of Black people by police officers led the Black Lives Matter movement and the What's My Name movement, or Say My Name, Tell My Name movement, to put together rallies with just enormous numbers of people, mostly masked. And then they went a little bit haywire and had within them some provocateurs. And Portland was kind of the center of that for the country, with people who I think for the most part came up from Eugene, part of the anarchist fringe down there. Then you had the Proud Boys and the white nationalists coming on the other side. And instead of having the kind of huge rallies that everybody on this call remembers from the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the early environmental movement, you had these things that looked a lot more like the riots that happened after Martin Luther King's assassination. And I think that stuff is just enormously counterproductive. That's the sort of thing that Trump just loves. If I were part of QAnon and into sending out conspiracy theories, my conspiracy theory would be that the people that are in there carrying their guns and throwing their bombs may well be folks that really want to get Trump elected. Because it is just so incredibly counterproductive in terms of the people that we're trying to get the undecideds to vote the right way in this election. But once we get ourselves past this infectious period, and I should say for young people, there's really confusing evidence as to what this coronavirus is going to be doing in terms of long-term impacts and what it's doing to the nervous system as well as your pulmonary system and your heart. If you are young, this is not a good time to be going out and engaging in demonstrations where you are shouting and chanting, and I mean, that's just dumb. And so it won't happen for a while because these are all kind of smart people. But if you recall last year, the Time Magazine's Person of the Year was young Greta Thunberg, and she was emblematic of this whole generational group that was multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious, and all sharing in a common value, saying we want to have a future. And we're scared to death that what is happening is there's probably nothing in climate change that will cause human beings to go extinct. When we say existential, that's not saying it's like thermonuclear war where you wipe everything out. But we're just talking about spectacular diminutions in the quality of life and the carrying capacity for people in the world that exists afterwards. And they're genuinely frightened about that and motivated by it. So I think if they do pull things together and you have these vast outpourings of folks who, especially folks who can vote, then it makes a difference. I mean, to take it on the other side, Donald Trump luxuriates in rallies. I mean, if you get 20,000, 30,000 people out there, he really feels that he's been affirmed, and he will go far more aggressively toward that. Well, the same sort of thing happens on the other side. And if we can get not 20 or 30,000, but 50 or 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000 routinely, time after time, as measures are coming up before Congress, as judicial appointments are being considered, as crucial decisions are being made about the nation's future. I think they used to say that the courts read the newspapers. Well, politicians read the rallies, and they assume for every person that's out on the street, there are 20 sympathizers that are sitting at home.
Ann Sundstrom's got a question. At least she's, Ann, do you want to unmute yourself or do you want me just to read what you said?
I can't add much to it. Where does atomic energy research stand currently? I forget the name for the kind that is like the sun. We used to be hoping that we could get that to get energy.
Yeah. Okay, well, this can get very wonky, and to the extent that I start veering in that direction, I'm going to count on Gene to pull me back. But the nuclear energy that exists anywhere on the planet now, even in an experimental way, bears no resemblance at all to nuclear fusion. These are all nuclear fission reactors, the commercial ones and the research ones. Though there are some research going on in Europe in particular, and we're building a new facility, I guess now in Livermore, that is trying to use a form of deuterium-tritium fusion. It has been the dream for the last 50 years, and I'm deeply skeptical. That's not skeptical that it can't be done. I've got a lot of faith in human creativity and ingenuity to pull something like this together. But if you look at this piece of machinery, it is the most complex bit of engineering that humanity has ever attempted. And to think that we will be able to crank those out so inexpensively that it can compete with other sources of energy just seems to me to be remarkably unlikely. Then the other part of that is that is the simplest of the fusion reactions, deuterium tritium, and it comes with it some flaws. It produces a high neutron flux and it radiates the inner walls of the containing vessel, and weakens them, and produces a fair amount of radioactive waste. In fact, there are some people who think that if you actually can build that kind of reactor, instead of using it to generate electricity, you should be using it to breed uranium-238 up into plutonium-239 for fission reactors. So it's really part of a combined fission strategy. So, but there is there are various advanced nuclear fusion cycles that, if we could do, would produce very clean energy and produce it at a constant pace around the clock. And that would be attractive if you can figure out a way to do it inexpensively. And
Thank you.
The stuff that we all talk about when we say nuclear energy is the other. It's fission. It's the one that folks have been fighting about forever. I don't think we're going to build any more fission reactors in the United States. They have become breathtakingly expensive. Now a very high multiple of the cost of renewables for a new fission reactor. The utilities that have done it all wish that they hadn't. And it's the nuclear issue, as in political terms in this country, is how long we are going to continue to let those reactors operate. Many of them have now exceeded their design life, and we're stretching them out a little bit longer because it is a carbon-free form of energy. Final thing on nuclear, to the extent that you're using nuclear fission, again, the current generation of reactors here, it's very difficult to come up with a principled stance that says we can do it, but you can't do it. And if you're going to be doing that, you have to have a way to enrich uranium to the point that there's enough uranium-235 and or plutonium to have a sustainable fission reaction. And if you get it to that level of enrichment using what most commonly now what you use is centrifuges, then you can continue to put the stuff through the centrifuges for many, many, many more cycles, and you get it enriched enough that you can get a nuclear bomb. And we're deeply suspicious of folks that are doing this. It happened in India, and they've got a nuclear bomb. It happened in Pakistan, they've got a nuclear bomb. It happened in Israel, they've got a nuclear bomb. In Korea, they didn't even fake it. They just built a nuclear bomb. But there is nothing that Iran has proposed to do that isn't an essential part of a nuclear fuel cycle. And we've just been deeply skeptical of what kinds of controls will be over their centrifuges and what kinds of controls will be over other enrichment processes and reprocessing processes. So that risk of nuclear proliferation is one that has caused us to be less than robust in our enthusiasm for this stuff internationally. Final thing is, so far in the history of the world, there has been only one country, South Africa, that has ever developed a nuclear weapon and then shut it down and decommissioned its arsenal. We have reduced our arsenal, as has Russia, but now, as China has come on the scene, we are putting more and more effort into ever more sophisticated nuclear weapons. And while our focus, understandably, is on climate, if you're talking about genuine threats, we shouldn't forget the threats from the early 50s and the early 60s, when the nuclear freeze movement and the nuclear winter movement and these other things were capturing public attention. We are in as dangerous a situation now as we were then, and arguably more dangerous, because what we were talking about then was, what if someday a madman came into power? And now we know that that's a very real possibility. I am scared as hell of Donald Trump having his thumb on the button. And there's also the possibility of technological problems. I mean, we've had a dozen instances, both in Russia and the United States, where we were within a hair's breadth of a strike going off. And it's a scary part of the world.
Thank you so much.
We're
No,
going to need to wipe this up.
right.
But let's have the last question that Tom Spiro wanted to ask, and then thank you all very much. Can you?
Tom?
Okay,
Oh,
thanks.
it says Gordon wants to come in too now.
Gordon, maybe ask Gordon first.
Gordon?
Okay,
Do you want to ask a question?
yes, please. Dennis, as you know, over history, litigation has played a very important role in instigating and enforcing certain of the kinds of changes we're interested in accomplishing. How do you see the role of litigation emerging now in dealing with climate change and affecting some of the things we'd like to have happen?
A brilliant and powerful and depressing question, Gordon. There are a number of legal theories using things like the public trust doctrine that have been advanced by often by litigants who are 15, 16, 18 years old, represented by professors at universities, to sue on the basis of climate change, basically suing on their interest in having a future. And there are any number of less sweeping things where litigation has come up against pipelines, has come up against various kinds of synthetic fuels development, it's come up against fracking. And all of that stuff depends upon levels of interpretation about whether a regulation was correctly designed, correctly issued, whether the rationale behind it passes the giggle test when a court looks at it and recognizes there were some politics involved in it. And so everybody says that the courts should just follow the law and you can't bring your own judgment to it, but the court system has always had elements of judgment to it. Even the originalists, when they're trying to figure out what did the framers of the Constitution really mean, it's hard for me to believe that the framers of the Constitution had any concept that we would consider an individual to be a member of a well-organized militia if he has no militia connection, and that well-armed meant a weapon that is capable of firing literally hundreds of bullets a minute, and that we are able to pack away tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition in people's houses and carry them into rallies. So the originalist is what the Supreme Court decides they meant by their language, and that's true for Scalia every bit as much as it was for the liberals of the 1960s. That court system of the 1960s and 70s, which brought a great deal of progress. I mean, Congress passes laws, and often they are really difficult to decipher. I mean, it's hard to believe that 435 representatives and 100 senators put their heads together with professional staff and produce some of this stuff. But it's unintelligible, and you have to issue regulations to make sense of it. And the courts have been overseeing those regulations in ways that have been very pro-environment now for the last quarter century. Trump has appointed an extraordinary number of judges to federal district courts, to federal courts of appeal, and now, as Mitch McConnell rams through this latest example, maybe before the election, we will have a 6-3 majority of arch conservatives on the court. And we had that question, and please excuse me, and I don't mean to be offending anyone with this, although I know as I utter the words I will offend someone in this group, but we will have on the court not only 6 arch conservatives to 3 not arch conservatives, a couple of moderates and 1 liberal, but we will have, I think at that point, 7 Roman Catholics on the court that are going to be discussing Roe v. Wade and a woman's right to choose. And some of them may, in fact, not let their personal values influence their decision, but it's hard for me to think that bodes well for people who believe that if women have a right to choose, it's going to be helping us with the population issue. All of which is to roam all over the countryside, Gordon, and say we had a time when the courts were our friends and where some of the most effective and powerful environmental organizations in the nation were the Natural Resources Defense Council, Earth Justice, Environmental Defense Fund, the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. I'm afraid that the easy days are now probably behind us until we manage to get rid of a generation of judges.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Well, with that, Tom, you had something that you wanted to ask to end up with.
Hopefully something I can answer on an upbeat note.
Just a brief follow-up.
Dennis, you get to end with anything upbeat after Tom's question, if you like.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to be downbeat if I can help it, but just to follow up briefly on Jean's question about the effectiveness of masses of people getting together, which you answered very appropriately. A whole lot of us oldsters are not going to buy tickets to the mall anytime soon, even if COVID ends. But we could be writing letters, we could be calling and so on, provided that there was an organization out there, and again, I come back to that, that's capable of focusing our effort and saying, now is the time to write to Congressman XYZ, because this measure is coming up and it's part of a larger package of things. That sort of, maybe that's what you were talking about, a gray-green coalition, but it needs that level of specificity to make it work.
Okay, I'll give you my ranked choices. The most effective thing I think you can do is to go meet with your political representatives when they're in town. It's not much needed in Seattle because we are represented by an environmental, I wouldn't say zealot, but she's good on all of the issues that we've talked about here. And both of our senators are decent, though maybe not out at the edge. But there's the most effective thing you can do is these face-to-face communications. They really matter because you put them on the spot. They know it's a constituent and they have to pay attention and think about the issue. The next best thing you can do is write a thoughtful letter. And this isn't the letter that you get in a mimeograph format that you've downloaded from the web. It's something that shows that you have looked at the issue, you know something about it, and you're communicating an intelligent viewpoint on it that lets them know that that's something where they see one of those and they know this is a person that isn't only communicating with me, but is likely to be an opinion leader in his or her neighborhood. And if they can write this kind of persuasive letter to me, they can make that kind of persuasive case to a large number of people at fill in the blank, at the Rotary Club, at their church, at wherever there are people who respect them. The next best thing is telephone calls. If you happen to know the representative or the senator and you can get through, that's wonderful. For most of us, that's just not doable. In which case your telephone call goes on a tabulation sheet. You're on one side or you're on the other side. And it's important that the other side doesn't have far more lines on the tabulation sheet, but it's a 15-minute phone call is a worse thing than a 2-minute phone call because they just get irritated that you're wasting their time. They just want to know, are you pro or con? And I think probably the least effective thing you can do is email. And the very least effective thing is somebody circulates an email and asks you, copy this text and send it as your own. I mean, at that point, it's just part of the noise that passes through the office. If there is something where you're using a social media platform that for something that is thoughtful and provocative and relatively brief, 2 pages long, and you get 500,000 people signing it, yeah, that will cause people to perk up and pay attention. But 100 people signing something that is 1 paragraph long and is just sort of, it doesn't hurt anything, but it's just not in the same league as going to a meeting when they're in town. And frankly, a lot of these political meetings are not very well attended. If you go there, you'll be one of 12 or 15 people. And it's a good opportunity to really make your case effectively.
Thank you.
The upbeat thing at the end, I suppose, you know, as I did tonight, I've spent much of my life giving talks that are a little bit depressing. My wife basically never attends them because she gets more than enough of me around the house. But some years ago, she did go to one of them with me, and I did my usual song and dance. And at the end of it all, I think everybody was sort of contemplating committing seppuku because it was a hopeless thing. And Gail, who is clearly the smartest member of our couple, as we're driving home, says, "You know, Dennis, you claim to be a conservation biologist at heart, and you believe in Darwin. What is the competitive advantage of pessimism?" And of course, there is none. Unless you believe that there is hope, you're not going to do anything. That is the most important source of defeat, is if you really think there's nothing that you can do. I don't want to sell goofy hope. I mean, things are going to be bleak on climate no matter what we do at this point, because we have wasted 50 years. And having done that, now it's going to take us quite a while to unwind it. We're really building, hopefully, a better world for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. But nevertheless, we can do that, and that by itself is hopeful. Gordon will take some exception to this because this is, I think, pretty bad science. But I like to think of it, at least metaphorically, that all critters want to survive. I mean, if you find yourself under threat, you will do what you can to escape that threat. And the exceptions to that are sometimes you will sacrifice yourself for the well-being of your overall species or your family to pass on your genes, as it were. It would be nice to believe that instinct for survival is something that we possess as a species, and that as we find ourselves in worse and worse conditions, it will really click into action, and that we really need something that gives us the ability to do bold things. I mean, China was at one time making no solar panels at all. Germany passed something called a feed-in tariff, which suddenly made solar panels very economically competitive in the German marketplace, despite the fact that Germany's climate is very much like Seattle's. And in an incredible gift to the planet, they didn't demand that those panels be made in Germany. They'd buy them from anyone. China saw that opportunity, and they reached out and did for solar panels what we had done for computer chips and had done for any number of technologies, for jet planes, where the government for defense bought a whole bunch of them and drove them down and gave Boeing enough experience that we were able to set up a commercial airline business. They did that for solar panels. They provided subsidies, they gave free land, they gave no interest loans. They educated their people in the best universities in the United States and Australia and Europe. And they built an industry. From producing 0 solar panels, 10 years later, they were producing more than 90% of all the solar panels on the planet. And they've driven down the cost of this technology by a factor of about 30 in the course of doing that. It's just stunning, but it was a national commitment. This became a priority. And we're just going to have to do that with a wide variety of things, from electric automobiles to battery storage to hydrogen power to new advances in offshore wind to what have you. I'm a strong believer that America is a fairly effective counterpuncher. We stayed out of World War II for a very long time while Hitler was overrunning Europe and the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere was being dominated by Japanese troops. And then there was Pearl Harbor, and we had the most amazing mobilization of resources that probably has ever taken place on the planet. You have not much of anything going on or talking about Kennedy, I guess, when he was running for office, was talking about the missile gap. But by and large, it wasn't until Russia put up its Sputnik that in America, suddenly we geared ourselves up for a space race and really committed to putting a person on the moon swiftly. We can do this sort of thing if we get the proper will. And I think a gray-green alliance will be a really important element of getting that will stirred up. And so maybe one of the big things for you to do is, in addition to communicating with your members of Congress, communicate with your friends across the country. This it's not that important in Seattle, but it's really important in a great many cities where that kind of alliance could turn politics around. In any case, that's as upbeat as I can probably make it. Thank you all for inviting me over tonight. It's, as always, a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much,
Thank you.
everybody. Yes.
It's a lot.